Okay. All right. Thank you for closing the door. So we've been talking about how there was a period of transition. This was a period of transition that played out over the course of, let me just move this a little bit of the way. This played out over the course of several centuries. This was a transition from the world of the prophets and the world of the Chachamim, and we have the institution that joined the two together as the men of the Great Assembly. We're all familiar with this. But if you recall, when we were discussing the men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, as well as when we've been discussing particular individuals, unique individuals, like, we spoke about Shimon HaTzadik, for example, there was a real crisis of faith that people experienced. People really were struggling, especially as the Alexander and the Macedonians, who Hellenized much of the Middle East, as they were marching down in conquest, they took over Eretz Yisrael, and there was an incredible desire on the part of many people to assimilate into the predominant and prominent Hellenistic society. And there was an attempt on the part of Shimon HaTzadik and Antignos Ish Socho to combat this by talking about what Torah values are and how they differ than those of the Hellenes around them. But let's take a little bit of a step back. As was mentioned, as we spoke about, we said that there was a great period of alienation. There was a time when Jews just weren't quite sure how to accommodate the Greek culture that was predominant and their own Judaism, and this gave rise to various different groups and ideologies. And what really seemed to have been the part that was most painful and difficult for individuals to deal with was the loss of prophecy. It used to be that if people needed to know what they needed to know, all they would do is go and ask a prophet. And the prophet would tell them exactly what Hashem wanted, what God wanted. Likewise, also, if they knew what they needed to do, all they would do is that, and they would know that their requirement had been met, and Shalom Al Yisrael. That's all. There was this incredible magical key that they had access to the king in the palace. But that was changing now. Prophecy was on the decline, and we had the Chachamim, the sages, institutionalizing rituals like prayer, public fast days, and showing them the proper path, a new way to sort of interface with Hashem. And this was a source of frustration that many people felt. This was an institutionalized service of God. And while perhaps it makes sense to us in the modern world, we can understand the rhythm, we can understand the ritual, this was something that people really struggled with. They wanted to know that what they did mattered, and they also wanted to know if their prayers were effective. At one point, the prophet would just tell them, you prayed well, God has heard your prayers, but that wasn't happening any longer. So it was into this breach that the individual of Choni HaMe'agel appears. Choni HaMe'agel, oh, nuts. Sorry about that. Choni HaMe'agel was someone who hearkened back to the old days, yet at the same time, he was no prophet. And he was an individual who was able to perform wonders and solicit a response from Hashem. And, perhaps this was a great relief to many people. But this was also a source of incredible tension. And one of the best-known stories about Choni HaMe'agel highlights this tension between the laborious, the routine service of Hashem that was coming to the fore, and this desire for immediate contact with Hashem. Where do we see this? We see this in the story of Shimon ben Shetach and Choni HaMe'agel. This is the very famous story. There's several well-known stories about Choni HaMe'agel. He for many people is remembered as the Jewish Rip Van Winkle, the man who slept for 70 years. And we'll talk about what that means later on. But let's talk about the tension that existed between Shimon ben Shetach, who represented the rabbinic world of the time, and Choni HaMe'agel, who represented this callback to ancient practice, ancient ritual, and ancient access to Hashem. Let's take a look here at this source. This source is, and it's not working now again. Let me do it this way. Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, the Holy One, blessed is he, has retained 3 keys, and they are kept in his own hands, and he has not entrusted them to the hand of any messenger, namely the key of rain, the key of childbirth, and the key of resurrection. Not only does God keep a close handle on these things, he does not only give them to people, but he also does not give them to angels. Hashem stands over these 3 offices, let's say, and only he controls them. This is a theological point. Certain matters are given to Hashem, and they're outside the hands of man to have any influence over. They're entirely in the realm of divine providence. It's almost as though this parable that's given through the language over here of keys is like there's this storehouse of good stuff that Hashem has, and he's the only person who has the key to it. It will only be opened when he walks down to the door and opens it up. However, the story of Choni HaMe'agel directly undermines this perception. It undermines this categorical nature of this statement. It implies that somebody can force God's hand. You can push Hashem to give the world plenty, even when perhaps Hashem was not terribly too keen to do so. Choni HaMe'agel is very reminiscent of Eliyahu Hanavi, and we're actually going to see that even the Chachamim themselves compare him to Eliyahu Hanavi. But he's somebody that when there is a famine, people turn to and they ask, please, Choni HaMe'agel, do something for us, make it rain. Similar to how Eliyahu himself stopped the rain and then brought the rain back, so too Choni HaMe'agel seems to have a similar capacity. However, he's also the object of very serious criticism, as we'll soon see. So let's take a look at the story. This is the most well-known incident that Choni HaMe'agel is recorded to have participated in. And there we go. It happened that the people said to Choni HaMe'agel, pray for rain to fall. So we're actually looking now not at the Bavli's version, we're looking at the Yerushalmi's version of this narrative. And there are some differences, and we're going to talk about what they are. But here you have the Yerushalmi's version, and this is what we're going to look at first because it's much more succinct. He says that people said, we need rain. So he said, what did Choni HaMe'agel say in response? Okay, well, I'm so certain that rain is going to fall, so you'd better take anything that could be damaged in the rain, like the earthenware ovens that were used to roast the Korban Pesach, that were made of mud brick that would dissolve in the rain. Take them inside so they don't get destroyed in the rain. So what did he do? He prayed, and no rain fell. Okay. What does he then do? He draws a circle, he stood within it and exclaimed, Master of the universe, your children have turned to me because they believe me to be as a member of your household. The language that we're going to be focusing on here as a ben bias. He is a son of the household. This is a very important language and a very important distinction that we're going to be making. I am a member of your household. I'm a son of your household. And I swear by your great name that I will not move from here until you have mercy on your children. Immediately, it begins to rain. However, it wasn't raining hard enough for him. He wanted there to be enough rain to fill up all the reservoirs, the cisterns, and any I guess the groundwater also needs to be replenished. He said, I wanted abundant rain to fill the cisterns, the ditches, and the caves. So then the rain came down with great force. Whereupon he exclaimed, this is not the rain that I paid for. This is the rain of anger. This is a monsoon. This is not the good kind of heavy rain. Give us the rain of blessings and bounty. And they did. The rain fell then in the normal way. So, Marina's on it. What happens next? Well, we have Shimon ben Shetach. Shimon ben Shetach essentially said to him, were you not Choni, I would have pronounced a ban against you. But what can I do? You act like a spoiled child before God, and yet he accedes to your request, just as a father accedes to the request of his spoiled son. It's about you that the Torah says, this is in Mishlei, let your father and your mother be glad, and let her that bore you rejoice. So both from Choni's own conduct, from his words, from his assertion that the rain would definitely come, and from the way he's addressed by Shimon ben Shetach, he was an exceptional individual. He had a very unique relationship with Hashem. He is like the spoiled child that somehow manages to solicit from his parents everything that he wants. And here you have this description that's being described here as a father and a mother who are the only people glad about having such a child. Everyone else around you is not so pleased. Like the crabby kid that's in the mall that's having a tantrum. Perhaps the parents are happy. No one else is. That's a really bad analogy. And I'm sorry I said that. Strike it from the record. whatever, an indulged child, let's say, an indulged child that everyone else can see is indulged, but the parents don't quite get it. So here we have this conflict. You have Shimon ben Shetach, who is essentially the paragon of legal procedure, who exemplifies the relationship that Antignos Ish Socho speaks of, the servant relationship with the king, coming head to head with a man who basically personifies the son-father relationship with Hashem. Shimon ben Shetach, in his message, appreciates Choni's unique power to be a son spoiled by his father, but he also expresses reservations. He essentially said, if it was anyone other than you, Choni, if I heard anyone else acting this way, they would have been put into cherem. In essence, he was also concerned that Choni HaMe'agel's actions, his behavior, might dismantle the entire institution or the institutionalization of religion that the Chachamim were trying to put into effect, of praying 3 times a day, coming to shul, coming to minyan, saying brachos before you eat, developing a relationship through hard work, effort, and Torah study. There was a possibility that the nation would revert back to its old bad habits of relying on the prophet to take care of all of their needs instead of putting the time and the effort necessary to build that relationship with Hashem that the Chachamim were saying we need now to cultivate. Now, Shimon ben Shetach's misgivings about Choni HaMe'agel derived first and foremost from his awareness that such a character like Choni HaMe'agel, or Choni the circle maker, held immense and seductive power over the Jewish people. We have various statements from the Chachamim that essentially point out that Choni was very much an Eliyahu-like personality. Take a look over here. This is actually from Bereshis Rabbah. This is a midrash. And it says, basically, as a rabbinic commentary to the creation narrative, to the story, where it says that there was not a man on the earth to work the soil. The Chachamim explained there was no man to make men serve Hashem like Eliyahu and Choni HaMe'agel. Choni HaMe'agel is mentioned in the same breath as Eliyahu Hanavi. There's always going to be a certain nostalgia for the world of the prophet who can give very, very clear expression and meaning to what Hashem wanted and be that conduit to explain and talk on behalf of the Jewish people and also on behalf of Hashem. The voice that yearns to hear Eliyahu also is the same voice that cries out and wants to hang out with Choni HaMe'agel. This was a very seductive and very attractive option to the Jewish people because it's what they knew. It was a lot easier. But, Choni HaMe'agel, as we're going to see, was a transitional figure, much like everyone else at this time, much like Shimon HaTzadik. He was the last of that kind of person to basically hang around. We'll see that's not entirely true, but that world was no longer. We also have a parallel source that talks about Choni's importance to the Jewish people. Choni really represented everything that was old, good, and true. Take a look at this. This is the other story that people know well, but this is the Yerushalmi version. We're not going to look at the Bavli yet. But here we have Choni HaMe'agel, the circle maker. Near the time of the destruction of the first temple, he went out to a mountain to see his workers. Before he got there, it rained. He went into a cave. Once he sat down, he became tired and fell asleep. He slept for 70 years, during which time the temple was destroyed and was rebuilt a second time. And at the end of 70 years, he awoke from his sleep, left his cave, and saw a world completely changed. Take a look. Areas that had been planted with vineyards now produced olives. Areas that had been planted with olives now produced grain. So he asked the locals, what's going on here? And they said, who are you and why do you ask? To which he basically said, I don't know anything. I'm Choni HaMe'agel. And they said, well, we don't know if you actually are, in fact, Choni HaMe'agel, but one thing we do know is that whenever Choni HaMe'agel would walk into the temple, the place would light up. So that's what they did. He went to the courtyard, and indeed it did light up. And he said about himself, when the Lord restores the fortune of Zion, we were like those who dreamed. Right. Es Shivas Zion Hayinu Kecholmim. So we see here that Choni is presented as the light source of the temple. And again, we're not looking at the historicity of these comments. We're looking at what Chazal are trying to teach us, what they're trying to say. They're trying to say, at least in this statement here, that Choni HaMe'agel represented the divine presence in the Beis HaMikdash. And with his absence, it wasn't there. He came back, the presence was back. There was something unique, something special. He was a shining light for the Jewish people, the world that longed for Choni's power. However, it was precisely for this reason that Shimon ben Shetach was very suspicious, and Shimon ben Shetach really let him have it. The world of the Chachamim is, as I said earlier, based on the ethos of effort and hard work. And that world that they were establishing at that time was in danger of being completely uprooted, completely destroyed. We have this phenomenon of Choni HaMe'agel acting like the son who bursts his way directly into his father's house and speaks over any of his father's objections and finally solicits what he wants from his dad. This, again, is in opposition to Antignos ish Socho's concept, or the idea not of the son and the father, but rather the servant and the king. Choni took a different path than Antignos. His conduct was not that of the servant, it was that of a son, and not just any son, it was the spoiled son. And when we take a look at what the Talmud Bavli says about his interaction with Shimon ben Shetach, we see that there is perhaps an even greater criticism of him. Now, I'm not going to reproduce the entirety of the story because it's much the same. But this is the story when they needed rain. They asked Choni HaMe'agel to bring the rain, and it says here. And how am I going to do this? I might have to be conscious of the fact that it cuts off part of the screen. How we have it set up. All right. The problem is that the computer doesn't talk nicely to the projector because the projector communicates through VGA and our computer communicates through HDMI, and we have an adapter. But this is the downside of Scotch tape together technology. But let's take a look at what it says, or I'll read it here for you. Anyways, thereupon he drew a circle and he stood within it the same way as the prophet Habakkuk had done. As it was said, and I will stand in my watch, and I will take my position at the post. So here you see that Choni HaMe'agel is actually emulating more closely than just in his Weltanschauung and in his approach. He's actually mimicking the behavior of the prophets. Here we have the prophet Habakkuk, one of the 12 minor prophets, the Treyasar, who did much the same. And Shimon ben Shetach's criticism on the right side is much harsher than in the Yerushalmi. Take a look. Thereupon Shimon ben Shetach said to him in a message, "Were it not that you are Choni, I would have placed you under a ban. For were it like in the years of famine, the times of Eliyahu, in whose hands were the keys of rain, would not the name of heaven be profaned through you? But what can I do to you? You act petulantly before the omnipresent. He grants your desire like a son who acts petulantly before his father." And he goes even further. I didn't include this in the text up here. I didn't want to give you a page full, a wall of words. But he essentially says, you're like that kid in the supermarket who wants the candy, he wants the cookies, and he cries and screams, and finally the father relents. He uses those examples. He says, you're like that kid that wants nuts, almonds, peaches, and pomegranates, and Hashem, your father, gives it to you. Of you, it is said, let your father and your mother be glad, and let her that bore you rejoice. So we have two differences between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi. We have the Yerushalmi that is very succinct, but here we have the Bavli that actually goes out of its way and says this was a man who was emulating the prophets of old. He too stands at the watch like Habakkuk does. In Choni's description, we can see that he was attempting to preserve the power of the prophet even in a time when prophecy was gone. He was acting like the Nevi'im. He was acting like the prophets. And the second point where this differs from the Yerushalmi is that in Shimon ben Shetach's response, Choni is referred to and highlighted, underlined as that spoiled kid who cries and screams for candy, and their parents always give it to them. This is the child that will perennially ask. The father is just so proud of their son that they just don't see what others see. Hence, we have that verse, we have that verse, it's not here, but we have that verse, let your parents be proud of you because nobody else is. This was a danger. Why persist with all the efforts to pray, the efforts to fast for rain, like is recorded in the Talmud as a requirement when there is a drought? All we have to do is just walk down the road and kick open the door of Choni HaMe'agel and his descendants, and they'll be able to affect the rain. Why bother putting in the effort? Just get the non-profit prophet to do it for you. And Shimon ben Shetach's reservations were not unfounded. The knowledge that there was somebody around who could just go ahead and do stuff and get things done really brought about a religious laxity in the people around him. And we see this in very many comments made by Chazal about Choni HaMe'agel and his generation. We see that the Gemara in Tainus also relates that even after Choni passed away, his son and then his grandson, a man by the name of Abba Chilka, were able to effect the same miracles of bringing down rain that Choni HaMe'agel did. And this was quite problematic. One loses the awesome sense of mystery, the image of the inclining ear that's waiting for us to pray to him, the attentive heart. The problem was we were acting with a certain level of over familiarity. Familiarity breeds contempt. And this was the source of the rabbinic ire. The rabbis understood this and all that more when they said, and it's reported in Maseches Brachos, Choni HaMe'agel behaved in an overly familiar fashion with Hashem. The overly familiar is not a good thing. It refers to a state of arrogance, presumptuousness. It fosters an attitude of conceit towards oneself and one's surroundings, and also with regards to God. Parents are normally proud of their children. They don't see perhaps what others do. And this is exactly what Shimon ben Shetach was saying. This is not a good thing to do. And we also see that this became Choni HaMe'agel's undoing. We're going to see this in two ways. We're going to see this in Josephus, and we're going to see this in the Talmud also. This is from Josephus. This is from Antiquities of the Jews. There once was a certain Chonia who was a religious man and dear to God. Once in a time of drought, he prayed to God and ended the drought. God had heard his prayer and sent rain. This man hid himself when he saw that civil war continued to rage, but he was taken to the camp of the Jews and was asked to place a curse on Aristobulus and his fellow rebels. Just as he had been able to stop the drought, so too will he be able to bring the competing faction to their end. But when, in spite of his refusal and his excuses, he was forced to speak to the mob, he stood up in their midst and he said, "O God, King of the universe, since these men standing beside me are your people, and those who are besieged in Yerushalayim are also your people, in fact, they're Kohanim, I ask you, don't listen to this group of people. Don't bring to pass what they wish or that they desire. Don't listen to their tefillos. They're praying that their enemies die. Don't listen to them. Don't kill Jew. Don't listen to the prayers of one Jew to kill another Jew." And what happens? When he had prayed in this manner, the villains among the Jews who stood around him stoned him to death. And again, Josephus was talking here of the period of civil war between two Hasmonean factions, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. They were struggling over the monarchy, who's going to be the next king. And they relied on a miracle worker to do the fighting the war for them. And Choni HaMe'agel, ultimately, his undoing, at least according to this, was the fact that he refused to play ball. It wasn't Choni that people wanted. It was his wonder-working ability that people wanted. This was ultimately Choni's undoing, playing the role of the prophet instead of encouraging people to pray, fast, do good deeds, mitzvos, and put in the hard work and effort that it takes to be a good person. Now, we have a different story here, and this comes to us from the Talmud Bavli. Here it was. Now, the Talmud Bavli starts off with a description or a statement from Rabbi Yochanan. Now, I'm going to point out to you, this is the same Rabbi Yochanan who said that God holds three keys: the key of rain, the key of childbirth, and the key of the resurrection of the dead. The key of rain is a major theme here, but he comes back, and Rabbi Yochanan said, throughout his life, that religious man, Choni, was troubled about the meaning of the verse in Shir Hamalos, when the Lord brought back those that returned to Zion, we were like dreamers. He asked, Choni HaMe'agel struggled with this idea. Is it possible for a man to dream continuously for 70 years? Choni was like a petulant son. How can you just not ask God and he won't give it to you? The idea of not realizing your aspirations, your dreams, or putting in hard work and maybe not realizing those dreams in your lifetime or seeing the fruits in your lifetime was something that Choni couldn't understand. He was troubled by this. He couldn't fathom sitting and waiting for 70 years to rebuild the temple and the Jews to come back to Yerushalayim. How does that work? Because that wasn't Choni's world. Choni's world was the here and now of immediate gratification. All he needed to do was draw a circle and God would have relented. That was not the world that Chazal lived in. That was not the world that we live in. And frankly, David HaMelech wrote this. This wasn't even the world that David HaMelech really thought was optimal. He said, yes, sometimes we won't see the end result of our actions. And this comes out much more clearly in the Talmud Bavli's version of Choni's 70-year sleep. One day he was journeying on a road and he saw a man planting a carob tree. And he asked him, how long does it take for the tree to bear fruit? The man replied, 70 years. Again, it's that 70 years, the 70 years to return to Zion. This is how the Chachamim are explaining how Choni HaMe'agel came to understand this concept, this idea. He said it takes 70 years before a carob tree will produce fruit. I don't know if that's botanically true or not, but I'll take Chazal's word for it, at least as far as the story goes. He then further asked, are you going to live another 70 years? If you live for 120 years, that's great. But if you're in your 50s, you're probably not going to see the fruit of this tree. The man said, well, when I was born, I already found grown carob trees that my grandfather planted so that I could enjoy their bounty. Just as my grandfather did for me, I will plant these for my children. So Choni HaMe'agel is meeting the mindset that is diametrically opposed to his own. The idea of hard work, putting in the effort, delayed gratification, and perhaps not even seeing the fruit of your labor, but trusting and hoping that it will make the world a better place for your grandchildren. So what does he do? Choni sat down to have a meal. He was overcome by sleep. And as he slept, a rocky formation enclosed upon him, hiding him from sight, and he continued to sleep for 70 years. So Choni HaMe'agel had lived his entire life being pampered, being satisfied, just doesn't get it. And so now he has to sleep for 70 years so that he can come to terms with this idea, with this concept. Hopefully in 70 years, he'll reach a certain level of maturity. So what happens next? When he awoke, he saw a man gathering the fruit of a carob tree, and he asked him, are you the man who planted the tree? The man said, no, I'm the grandson. Thereupon Choni said, oy gewalt, I must have slept for 70 years. He then caught sight of his donkey, which happened to be hanging around him for the past 70 years. And the donkey had gone on to have grandchildren of its own. Several generations of mules were born. And 70 years had passed. So what does he do? He returned home. He went to his house and went back to his hometown. And he said, is the son of Choni HaMe'agel still alive? And they said to him, no, his son is no more. His grandson now lives in his house. That was Abba Chilkiah, if you recall. We mentioned him earlier, as was able to effect the same miracles. So he said to the townsfolk, I'm Choni HaMe'agel. I'm Choni, the circle maker. They didn't believe him. So what does he do? He retires to the study house, to the base medrash, and he overhears scholars say, we used to have a really difficult time understanding things. Not like the days of Choni HaMe'agel. When Choni HaMe'agel was around, we could get this, just the learning went so much easier, so much better. Whoever came to the study house would resolve any of the difficulties they had. But today's different than the days since his death, or this disappearance, when we have been able to hold cup, as they say. Now he's saying, suddenly, magically, things are back the way they were when Choni HaMe'agel was around. We wonder what's going on. So Choni HaMe'agel says, well, I'll tell you why that's happening. It's because I'm back, guys. And they also didn't believe him. Now, this hurt him greatly, and he prayed for death, and he died. Rabbis said, hence the saying, either companionship or death. So again, who started this discussion? Who's telling us the story? It's Rabbi Yochanan. It's Rabbi Yochanan who's that very individual who asserted that the keys of rain were not given to malachim, they were not given to any agents other than Hashem himself. It was that same individual who now is describing Choni HaMe'agel being bothered by the problem. How could somebody sit and wait for the temple to be rebuilt in 70 years? The Choni was unable to come to terms with the notion that some might not see the end result of their expectations, and he was unable to come to grips with this. He was unable to come to terms with it. He even dies as a consequence. He was like a person from a bygone era who has now moved into a new world that just doesn't have room any longer for somebody like Choni HaMe'agel. Upon awakening, Choni encounters this new world, and his old life stopped the moment he fell asleep. None of his friends, none of his family are still around. The world has only continued. The donkey had several grandchildren already by this point. And nobody knows that Choni HaMe'agel is, in fact, Choni HaMe'agel. He calls home. They don't believe him. He goes to the study house, the place where he was most comfortable, and they're still talking about Choni HaMe'agel, but they don't believe him. The world has progressed 70 years. The 70 years was a long, long time. The world of miracles is no longer. The world is now accustomed to living in doubt. We don't have prophets anymore. At this point, 70 years after Choni HaMe'agel disappears, we're now the kind of people who can now understand doubt, not knowing if Hashem hears our prayers, but also understanding that we still are obligated to be mispalel, to pray. We're still obligated to do mitzvahs, and we're still obligated to do what we're called upon to do in order to hopefully, solicit the kind of manifestation of bounty and fruitfulness that only God can bestow. And it's interesting to note, the Ramchal, Rabbi Chaim Moshe Lotzato, he wrote in the Mesilas Yesharim that there are two aspects to holiness. It begins with labor and ends with reward. You have to work hard to achieve it. This was the approach of Shimon ben Shattach. God does not promise to open a door or provide a direct response. The world of the sages demanded or required a different routine for communication. The kind of communication between man and God required discipline, rhythm, and a regular timetable. Choni HaMe'agel was a relic of a bygone era, and hopefully by the time he passed away, he finally got it, because that was definitely not part of the world that Choni HaMe'agel lived in. Let's continue this a little bit further. Let's talk about another individual, Hanina ben Dosa. Now, they were not contemporaries. Choni HaMe'agel lived during the time of the earlier part of the Second Temple era. If you recall, he slept for 70 years and he woke up and the second Beis HaMikdash had been rebuilt in the meantime. So Choni HaMe'agel lived at an earlier era. But here we have Hanina ben Dosa, who lived after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. He was a contemporary of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Remember, Yochanan ben Zakkai was the man who escaped from Jerusalem and established Yavna as a place of Torah study while Titus was still besieging, Vespasian rather. I believe it was Vespasian. Vespasian was still besieging Yerushalayim. So this was right. Well, he wasn't emperor yet. He was the general. That was how Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai got on his good side. That's how he was able to ask for Yavna by saying, you're going to become emperor. Not only that, but your son will become emperor too. And so when Vespasian went to Rome, when he was called out to become the emperor, Titus, his son, took over. And Titus was actually the general who oversaw the destruction of Yerushalayim. But that's how Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was able to get out scot-free and establish Yavnos, because he kind of buttered up Vespasian by telling him he's going to become the next Caesar, the next emperor. But Hanina ben Dosa was a contemporary of his. And he is actually, if you were to take a look at basically a spectrum, you have Choni HaMe'agel on one side and Hanina ben Dosa on the other side. Now, it's interesting to note, while the Talmud Bavli does say that Choni HaMe'agel was a Torah scholar, we really don't have any examples of Choni HaMe'agel's scholarship. We also don't have many examples of Hanina ben Dosa's scholarship. They were not necessarily ranked amongst the Chachamim. They were a secondary group. This was a group that had also an incredible influence on the Jewish people, but they were not part of Chazal, let's say. They weren't part of the Chachamim who sort of established a sort of Jewish ritual and Jewish practice and Jewish theology and philosophy. He was from the Hasidim Harishonim, the early saintly figures. And while Choni HaMe'agel represents the son-father relationship, Hanina ben Dosa, I believe, represents the servant-king relationship to an incredible degree. So let's compare the two together. This is a story. First, we'll come back to this Mishnah. This is a Mishnah in Avos. We'll come back to this soon, but it's about Chanina ben Dosa. All right. You know what? I didn't put this down. I'll tell you the story. Chanina ben Dosa was once walking through town, and he realized that all the inhabitants of his city were making free will offerings. They were all going together as a group, and he really wanted to offer a korban also, but he did not have the financial wherewithal to be able to do it. So what does he do as a pauper, somebody who has absolutely no money, no funds? He goes into a field, he finds a stone, and he chisels out a beautiful geometric design, and he wants to bring it to Yerushalayim, donate it to the Beis HaMikdash, so that either it can be incorporated into the structure or sold so that the funds could be used for the maintenance of the Beis HaMikdash. So he chisels out this rock, but it's too heavy for him to carry, so he asks 5 men to help him bring it out to Yerushalayim, to the Beis HaMikdash. And they told him, okay, we're happy to do it, but it's going to cost you 5 sela. He didn't have 5 sela. So Hashem performed the miracle. 5 angels appeared in the form of men, and Chanina ben Dosa walked over to them and said, hey guys, can you help me move this stone? And they said, sure, on the condition that you help us carry it. The moment that Chanina ben Dosa touches the stone, immediately he and the stone are transported to Yerushalayim, and the angels are not to be seen. They are nowhere. Chanina ben Dosa did not request the miracle. He was overwhelmed with sadness by not being able to offer the gift that others were offering, because he didn't have the privilege of the funds to do so, but he found a way to contribute in his own manner. But he was still stuck by not being able to bring it to Yerushalayim. By simply just extending his hand to put in the effort himself to help carry the stone, magically he's transported to Yerushalayim. He is the opposite of Choni HaMe'agel. Choni HaMe'agel draws the circle and challenges God. I'm not going to move until you give rain. Chanina ben Dosa has no desire to alter the natural order. He's a simple man. He's an unpretentious person whose sole desire is to take part in a religious devotional act. And it's precisely perhaps this simplicity that makes him deserving of the reward. He's never referred to in any of the Gemaras, and we're going to be taking a look at a few of them. He's never referred to as a son. He's always referred to as a man. He never is the son who demands from his father, but he's always the respectful servant who worships and stands before his king. He's rooted in the world of servants and service. He's the simple soul of a servant of Hashem. And it's because of this attribute, miracles manifest around him, but he never demands them. He never expects them. He never really speaks to them at all, to be honest. This is another story. Now, the Gemara brings story after story of Chanina ben Dosa. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, every day a heavenly voice is heard declaring that the whole world draws its sustenance because of the merit of Chanina, my son, Chanina ben Dosa. And Chanina, my son, is so poor, he only eats a handful of carobs from one Shabbos to the next. Every Friday, his wife would light the oven and throw twigs into it so as to not be put to shame, because they didn't have any food. But they had to keep up appearances. She had a bad neighbor who said, I know these people don't have anything. What are they cooking? Why is all that smoke coming out of their chimney? So she knocks on the door. The wife of Chanina ben Dosa runs away because she's so embarrassed. She doesn't want anyone to come in and see that there's no food cooking. The neighbor walks in, even though there's nobody to answer, and a miracle happens. The neighbor, saw the oven, saw the loaves of bread. He saw the kneading trough full of dough, and she calls out to Mrs. Chanina ben Dosa, bring out the shovel. You got to take the stuff out of the oven. They're starting to burn. And to cover for herself, she said, that's what I was doing. That's what I was planning to do all along. So Chanina ben Dosa, and also we see her, his wife, they don't ask for miracles. She's just simply embarrassed from her neighbors. Her life's not based on miracles. It's based on humility. And that humility leads the couple to perhaps try to conceal their impoverishment with smoke. They don't want to appear as paupers. But at the same time, this neighbor invades their privacy, and a miracle transpires. Here too, it's not the result of a demand. She didn't draw a circle and say, Hashem, you better make dough appear, or else I'm not getting out of this circle. She doesn't impose her poverty on a Kadosh Baruch Hu. But Hashem still intervenes and protects her from embarrassment. We have another story, and these stories go on about Chanina ben Dosa and his family. His wife said to him, how long will we go on suffering such great poverty? He said, well, what should we do? She said, well, why don't you pray for something? He prayed, and then there emerged a figure of a hand giving him one leg of a golden table. He saw in a dream that the pious would one day eat at three-legged golden tables, but he would only have a two-legged table. So he tells her, he says, okay, yes, I prayed. A miracle happened, but you know what? Maybe it's not worth it. And she says, you know what? You're right. It's not worth it. So what should we do? So he prayed for mercy, and the leg was taken back. Now, again, Hanina ben Dosa is just praying. He's not really asking for a miracle per se. He's saying, Hashem, I'm poor, just like everyone else. Can you please give me a job, or whatever it was he was asking for Hashem. A miracle happens, and he doesn't even want the miracle. He convinces his wife we should give the miracle back to Hashem. He educates his wife about who, his wife is seeking to escape poverty, and he shows her what value this world is versus the world to come. However he explained it to her, but she was satisfied also with that lesson. And in the end, the miracle was never taken advantage of. It was on sunset, Erev Shabbos, and Hanina noticed that his daughter was sad. He said to her, my daughter, why are you sad? And she said, a jar of oil got mixed up with my vinegar and I used it to light Shabbos licht. And he said to her, is that really what's troubling you? Don't worry about it. Just pour whatever you have in, and whatever burns, burns. Whatever doesn't burn, doesn't burn. Hashem, who commanded oil to burn, will also command the vinegar to burn. He's not also here not asking for a miracle, and his daughter's not asking for a miracle. She's sad, and he's essentially saying, have trust in Hashem. Just use whatever you have and pour it into the licht and just make use of it. Again, here we have Hanina ben Dosa, who's representing a certain piety, a belief and trust in Hashem. He's not pushing anything on anyone. He's not forcing God to perform miracles on his behalf. He's teaching his family about faith, about emunah, about bitachon. And he's also, and as I said before, he's not demanding miracles. So we see that he definitely represents perhaps the best of the Jewish people. His power and influence lay in the simplicity of his character, in his honesty, and his refusal to seek refuge in miracles. And there's also one final story that I'm just going to share. And again, I will preface that my deductions here are being derived from the Yerushalmi. The Bavli has a much different take on Hanina ben Dosa. I'm leaving that to the side because I think there's something really important to be said here about Hanina ben Dosa. Here we have another example. If one makes a mistake in his prayer, it's a bad sign for him. If he's a leader, he is a representative of the congregation, and it's a bad sign for those who have commissioned him. For a man's representative is equivalent to himself. It was related of Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa that he used to pray for the sick and say, this one will live and this one will die. And they asked him, how do you know? And he said, well, if I can feel it when I pray. If it just comes out, I know that it's being received. I know that Hashem is hearing it. And if I stutter, if I halter, if I'm not able to articulate it as clearly and as vociferously as I normally would, then I know that Hashem's not listening. So again, here we have Hanina ben Dosa, whose relationship to Hashem is not that of Choni HaMe'agel, who's able to push his way through. He has to listen very, very closely. He's still that servant. He's still that man that Hashem will perform miracles for, even though he doesn't ask it and even though he doesn't require it. His communication with Hashem is through such incredible subtlety. And that's perhaps the lesson that Shimon ben Shattach was trying to convey to Choni HaMe'agel. Your relationship is that of the child and the son. You can demand things of your father, and you can expect immediate results. Hanina ben Dosa represents the servant. He also represents the more attainable model for each and every one of us to achieve. He represents the world that Shimon ben Shattach was trying to establish, that he was trying to create. We're not going to be Choni HaMe'agel. We're not going to be able to demand things from Hashem. He's not going to listen to us. But we can daven, we can pray, and through subtle signs, we can also detect God's involvement, even in the minutiae of tefillah, like whether or not we stutter as we say it. He represents the servant who serves the king versus the petulant, indulged child that is so was not disciplined enough as a child and expects everything to be handed on them, expectant and presumptuous. And these are the two opposite extremes of these individuals, these kinds of individuals who are not chachamim per se. They're not the sages. They're not authors of the Mishnah, but they were the Hasidim who had a very powerful influence on Jewish ritual and practice. Chanina ben Dosa perhaps represents the best of who and what we can aim for at the very least, as he represents the way we can engage with Hashem in the reality in which we live, as opposed to Choni HaMe'agel, who represented the bygone era that did not survive his grandson. Anyways, that's it. That concludes the class, and I am now open to questions, comments, or rebuttals. Anyone online can unmute themselves, and anyone here can raise their hands, and I am eager to hear you disagree with me. And that's how you know the class is good.
Robert?
Yes, go ahead.
A comment and a question now. The comment is that, could it be that Jesus Christ came out of what you said, the household? I am the connection. I want to say with God, not Hashem, but that's what they say. I will be the king of the Jews. So I don't know if that has a relation with what you have just said.
You know, I'm going to dodge this question. I'm really not going to talk about Jesus.
Because you know of the connection that someone said this.
I understand, but we have so many things we could say about Yiddishkeit. We don't have to talk about Jesus. All right, Milton, go ahead.
There was one of the early descriptions of Chanina ben Dosa is that somebody was saying that Hashem said to Chanina ben Dosa, my son, which is the opposite of what we are to think of Chanina ben Dosa.
But it wasn't.
Servant.
Chanina ben Dosa never acted like the petulant son.
Right.
God can call him son.
Okay.
I'm the servant.
Okay.
Robert?
Go ahead.
What happened in between the first temple and the second temple? Were there any prophets and rabbis? What happened at that time?
Now, we spoke about that in one of the previous classes when we spoke about the men of the Great Assembly, because these were the individuals who came back. And yes, there were still prophets counted among them. Zechariah was one, Malachi was another, Haggai was a third. There were still prophets and prophecy. The book of Ezra and Nehemiah were written at this time. There was still prophecy at that time when the Jews were coming back. But the men of the Great Assembly describes a group of people, a coterie, that spanned an era, that time of transition when we were moving away from prophecy into a world of Torah study and the Chachamim. Go ahead, Eugene.
Any parallel that can be drawn between HaMe'agel and individuals like Baba Sali?
You know, I'm
probably getting into the territory, which is
so. You know, Baba Sali is Baba Sali, and I'm not going to ask any questions on Baba Sali. If you were to ask me how should you conduct yourself, I'll give you the advice that I from the class tonight. That's what I'm going to say. This is how I think people should conduct themselves. There'll always be people like Baba Sali in the world. I don't believe that. I don't think that I will ever become Baba Sali or could become Baba Sali. So this works for me. You know, there is always this tension. And this is a tension that's borne out even to this very day, the tension between the father-son relationship and the servant-king relationship. And you know where that came up most vociferously and most obviously? In the 1980s, when Chabad started singing, "We want Mashiach now," there was an incredible response. Who are we to demand things of God? We want Mashiach now. You say, Rabbanu Shalom, you're the master of the universe. Please send Mashiach. There are two ways we can approach this. We can view ourselves as children, and many people do. It's a legitimate approach. It's maybe not the approach that I recommend, but it is definitely a legitimate approach. And that's the approach taken by the Lubavitcher Rebbe and many Hasidic groups, that you can talk to Hashem in such a manner. Then you have the view taken by the Litvish non-Hasidic world, which is That's not how we talk to Kodesh Baruch Hu. They're both valid approaches. They're definitely sort of reflect both of these tendencies. Where I fall on this spectrum is, like how my teachers always said, that's not how you talk to Hashem, and that's kind of how I operate as well. But there will always be those people who are around who take a different view, and that's fine. There will always be a multiplicity of approaches to Yiddishkeit. But that was an argument that raged about 40 years ago. Anyways, that was the argument, whether and how appropriate it is to say we want to God. That was what the argument was entirely centered on, but how to speak to Hashem. But all right, anything else? Any other questions? Okay, we're good to go then. I will end the class, and we will reconvene soon. Be well, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Laila Tov, everyone.
Laila Tov, Loredana.
In any case, we need Hashem soon because there is so much mess in the world.